Is there a writing craft book on your bedside table? Has it been there for a while?
Do you keep meaning to get past chapter 2? Or chapter 1? Or just the first page?
Then the Words to Write By podcast is for you. Hi, I'm Renee. I teach composition and creative writing to college students. My background is in poetry, but I'm working on my memoir.
And I'm Kim. I'm trained as a science journalist, but now I'm trying my hand at short fiction. Each week we'll be tackling a chapter of some well-known, but perhaps not so well-read, writing craft book.
Together, we'll uncover brilliant insights, face the hard truths, and totally disagree when the author is wrong.
This is our podcast, after all.
And then we're going to take what we learn and apply it to our own writing.
By doing the book's suggested exercises.
We're inviting you to read along, or just tune in for the Cliff Notes version.
We're committed to improving our own craft, one writing advice book at a time, and we'd love for you to join us. Renee, what words have you written this week?
So I am deadline driven. I need deadlines. I need somebody else on the other side waiting for my stuff. I do sign up for workshops, and I had something due. It was 10 pages, and I was pretty lazy over the holiday break, but because of the deadline, I got 10 pages done. I hit like a eureka moment while I was writing. As a poet, I wasn't really trained in plot and exposition. So although I can write a scene and description, I sometimes have a hard time with other stuff. And I think I got there. Like it just kind of happened where I was like, oh, that's what you do. That was a great eureka moment for me. And so I'm riding that wave.
So not just that you got some plot out, but you actually think you tapped into what you need to do mentally to make it happen?
Mentally, but also for the character. When you're writing from the protagonist's point of view, how do you put in logical details in order to get the story moving? It's funny because usually the problem is the art of showing and not telling. My problem is that I was showing and not telling. I needed to tell more. I took the showing too much to heart. And so now I'm realizing, oh, you have to do both. And I didn't really know how to tell. I think I figured out how to tell. I think it's that what I'm trying to say.
You think you know how to tell now?
I think I know how to tell. Or at least I'm beginning to learn how to tell. Anyway, what words have you written?
Well, I'm back at working on this short story. And yesterday I tried to write and stuff came out, but not anything I was happy with. So today I pulled out the big guns and scheduled a 6:45 shut up and write session online. And I got myself a butt in the chair and I didn't get a ton written, but I think that I'm building the groundwork for getting it written. My goal next time we talk will be for me to say that, yes, I have gotten up every weekday and written something. We'll see if that happens.
Awesome. Can I bug you and text you and ask you?
Yeah, yes. Accountability is what this is all about.
All right. I'll be your, as my friend used to say, accountability buddy.
Before we start the podcast, a quick Patreon plug. If you're listening and you enjoyed this podcast and you'd like to get bonus podcasts and a chance to practice some of the stuff we're discussing, head on over to our Patreon site, Words to Write By Podcast, and you can sign on. We'll tell you more at the end of the show. This is it, the final chapter of John Gardner's The Art of Fiction, and it's all about plot, mostly. First, we go over Gardner's different types of plot and how to pronounce them. Next, we tackle the differences for plots for short stories, novellas, and novels. And all this is just a build-up for Gardner to detail how he comes up with, develops, and imbibes deeper meaning and themes for a short story that we're referring to as Fanny the Stripper. Trust us, it's worth staying for the stripper. So we finished the book.
Oh my God.
Did you ever think that you'd finish this book?
Not soon after starting it.
As I was going through it, maybe not quite after the first chapter, but definitely after the second chapter, I realized that the only way this was going to be read was if we had accountability buddies.
Even if we just had friends without this podcast, I think we would have abandoned this book.
I think we should just dive into the chapter, into plotting.
Plotting! There's lots of fun charts in this one. Do you feel like you got anything out of this chapter?
I did not get out what I thought I was going to get out. Because normally when I see the words plotting, it talks about advanced techniques, like the actual structure of how you're going to bring the characters to the climax, like whether or not you're going to flashbacks or how you're going to manage to different points of view. But when he gets to the more complicated stuff, he says, I will leave it to the reader to figure out the plotting of a novel with 2 or more parallel energetic plots. He's saying anything more complicated than a single protagonist storyline, he's not going to cover. And that was a little bit of disappointment because that's where things get tricky. I would assume that a single protagonist with a linear story would be a pretty easy thing to plot. Gardner says, no, it's not easy. And he goes into that detail.
He does a lot of what things are, but not how to do things.
Yeah, well, that's Gardner for you.
It was a lot of vocabulary, description of what kind of plots there are, what's wrong with those plots, and that's it. It's like, all right, great, thanks. Now I know what a argumentative plot is, and I know why they suck. But do I know how to do one if I wanted? Not really.
I had never known what a picturesque plot was.
I think it's picaresque.
I didn't know how to pronounce it either, apparently. A picaresque plot.
I did not know what one of those were either, but we do know what they are. We just had never heard the term.
Wikipedia was very useful here.
Wikipedia is your friend for this chapter.
So a picaresque plot is, like Huckleberry Finn, it's the classic on the road story where they're running into various people and things are happening, but there's not an overall dynamic plot that you're building to.
Yeah, you take a plucky character and they go through their adventures, their foibles as they go through life, but their characters don't always grow, or if they do, it's kind of on a superficial level.
It's basically all the TV dramas of the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, very episodic.
And the other requirement is that the person that you're following is a bit of a rascal or someone that's not quite on the straight and narrow.
Yeah, and we like those people though. I mean, I do.
What he was arguing was that there are intellectual plots and there are more of these energetic plots. Is that what he called them? Or Energeic. And while an intellectual plot can be very solid, it's never going to move us the same way as an energeic plot.
Yeah, those kind of allegorical plots.
Mm-hmm.
They're not as entertaining. You know what came to mind was old sci-fi, like Fahrenheit 451 or Brave New World. They were kind of preachy. The plot points were picked for their allegorical significance, but not so much for their entertainment. Anyway, moving along. So if, say, dear listener, you want to write a plot for a novel, how would you do that?
We went over this a little bit for one of our exercises where we started with the climactic scene and we had to work our way back. In this chapter, Gardner gives an example or a couple examples, and we're saving one of these examples for the end. He has the idea of a car accident between us, like a semi truck and a local vendor truck, and how he would build the plot from there.
And then you got to figure out who these people are, who's the main character, how they got into that accident in the first place.
And then you also need to think about what the scenes are that build up to that.
Right.
Introduce the character in their home life, embellishing upon the conflict, like bringing it out to the fore, and then having the traffic accident.
So it's that beginning, middle, and end classic storytelling. It comes from the Greek tragedy of Aristotle.
There's a lot of Aristotle in this one.
In fact, there is not very much original content, ideas, or anything in this chapter. If you read Aristotle's Poetics, he pretty much just covers everything Aristotle already talks about.
So basically he's doing what we're doing.
He is pretty much doing what we're doing, only he does it in a really funky way. Not as entertaining, I don't think.
Then he brings in the idea that if you just do a story where you come up with the characters and the plot points and the final climactic scene and all that, you've got a solid story. However, you're not going to reach deeper for the readers because you need to come up with a theme.
What he says, when you get like a plot without a theme, we get an accurate and totally convincing picture of what it feels like to, say, have a death in the family, what it is like to leave one's husband and children for a new free life, how it feels to be sued for malpractice or to lose an election. We do not get a close examination of some deep-rooted idea. The writer, in other words, has done the first job. He has created a convincing and illuminating sequence of events, but he has not done the second, which is to mine deeper, as Melville says. Dig out the fundamental meaning of events by organizing the imitation of reality around some primary question or theme suggested by the character's concern.
Right. And I often find this happens in my ideas where at a certain point I look at the story and say, oh, that's what this is about. Like I was working on and have abandoned probably 70,000 words of a story which involves people being able to get into somebody else's brain for a weekend. So people rent out their bodies like Airbnbs.
Nice.
It's fun and humorous and brought on by the whole Airbnb culture. But as I got working on it, I realized that what it fundamentally is looking at is what are humans going to do in an AI-driven world where we don't have jobs? Or where a lot of things that give us advantages now, like intelligence or particular skill set or particular ability, artistic ability, no longer matter because the AIs can do it as well as we can and faster and easier. So that was the underlying theme of the story. And once I got to that point, I knew how I was going to portray things. I knew how I was going to set up conflicts. I knew a lot more of what was going to be in there because that was the underlying theme.
So the theme acted as a kind of limitation that you can work within to help you make the choices that you wanted to make.
I'd say I wouldn't even call it a limitation. I think it opened up my eyes to the possibilities. It made me see what was important and what was lacking.
I really want to read that story.
Yeah, I want to read that story too.
Aww.
Well, this actually segues nicely to the second part of this book, where he uses the figures to discuss the plot structure of a short story, a novella, and a novel. It was actually quite illuminating, especially the novella, which usually people don't even mention. But I often find myself writing because I write longer than short stories, but I have yet to actually finish a novel, and a novella is much more attainable.
What's the difference between a short story and a novella and a novel?
I mean, length, obviously. A short story is like under 10,000 words. A novella, he says like 30,000, but I think by the time you get around 12,000 words that you're kind of in novella territory. People aren't going to purchase that as a short story. And then a novel is like, over 70,000 or 80,000 words.
Are there thematic differences or like structural differences?
Actually, there is. And I hadn't really thought of this. Let's go to Gardner because he actually did a pretty good thing. The idea is that in a short story, there's a single climax. Your action builds to climax, then you're done. And in a novella, there's multiple climaxes. He says, a novella has a series of climaxes, each more intense than the last, though it may be built, and perhaps, in fact, ought to be built out of one continuous action. He gives the example of a story following a single person where that person experiences numerous serious actions happening, and they're each getting more and more significant until finally there's the ending. Or some novella writers write, in effect, baby novels, shifting from one point of view or focal character to another and using true episodes with time breaks between them instead of a continuous stream of action. And that would be a cool way of getting the contents of maybe a novel, but in a much shorter form. And then finally, he had the crots, told in snippets, sometimes called crots, moving as if at random from one point to another, gradually amassing the elements, literal and symbolic, into a quasi-energetic action. And when I was reading that one, I thought of The Best Girlfriend You Never Had. Do you remember that one?
Yes. It is The Best Girlfriend You Never Had by Pan Houston.
So this is a short story that Renee read in class, and she shared it with me, and we were looking at it and we actually examined it quite a bit. The cool thing about it is it's just a scattered bit of aspects of this woman's life and just a jumble at it. Like the middle of the story, she's going back to when she was living with her parents and what she had to deal with there. And then at a certain point, it offshoots to her friend's experiences when he was mugged. They all come together. They don't feel like they're all connected, but they're all building to an emotion and a sense. It feels earned and justified and complete in a way that wouldn't have worked if it was a linear story or anything like that. But somehow Houston manages to get just this jumble of things to come out to really feel like an ending. That was my experience. What did you think?
Yeah. In fact, I really like these stories because they remind me of part poems. I used to write a lot of those where I'd write a poem and then I'd write another poem and they would all kind of add up in the end. So like this poem, they seem like they don't have much in common. And then you get to the last poem and it adds it all together and you're like, oh, and it was very clever ending. I like that.
I liked his comment about the novella being an elegant tracing of an emotional line.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas he says that a novel is like a symphony that in its closing movement echoes and resounds with all that has gone on before.
Yeah, that does actually sound nice. He wrote a good sentence.
Yeah. I think the idea of a novel is, because it's bigger, it's just a much thicker and more layered, like a symphony. There's a lot of stuff going on. He writes, unexpected connections begin to surface, hidden causes become plain, life becomes, however briefly and unstably, organized. The universe reveals itself, if only for a few moments. The novel as a genre has a built-in metaphysics. And I like this idea because It is a weird thing about a novel that it has a beginning and a middle and an end, and things happen and they all come together in a way that doesn't happen in the real world, because the real world is a whole bunch of random life. You take some work to take all the events of even a person's life and turn it into a novel, because in a novel, people show up just when it's convenient, just to keep the plot moving. Or someone doesn't do something that they would have done and everything comes together. The author is pulling strings. There is a metaphysics to the whole thing. And it is the author, who is God, that is doing all these things. And I like that.
Yeah. Later on, he talks about something they talked about when I was in grad school over workshopping materials. You want to put a bow at the end, but you don't want the bow too tight. You want to capture the messiness at the end of a novel. So yes, there is an author there making choices, leading us through. But when they get to the end, although there has to be an ending, it can't be too perfect.
Right. Otherwise, it feels, with the complexity of the world that you've gotten, it feels just like it couldn't possibly work out just that perfectly.
It's like the end of every Saturday morning cartoon and everybody laughs. We almost died, but we're okay. And we're going to be ready for the next episode.
Or even more so, those ones where everybody's storyline all seems to come to a conclusion. There's nobody that's hasn't achieved or hasn't done or hasn't changed something. There's nobody that's still kind of going after their own thing that didn't come together.
And they all lived happily ever after.
Except for the ones that didn't deserve it.
Except for the ones who didn't deserve it. He does mention that. He does go into that. The term energeic. Had you come across that term before?
Probably in a chemistry class. I don't know.
You probably did. I actually looked up the term. It comes from Aristotle, energesis. It's not normally used for plots. It's used for having to do with thought and our actions. And it's used in science. What's driving our actions and where does it come from? He was really reading a lot of Aristotle when he wrote this chapter.
He really wanted to work on the idea of a novel being a series of climaxes that builds to a point and then the denouement coming down.
He gives the arc. And it's the same arc that I learned when I was in beginning creative writing from a very good book by Janet Burroway called Imaginative Writing. That was our textbook. And it was really good, but she had the exact same arc in there. And she used Cinderella as the example, where you start with a character and you give that character a desire and you give that character agency. Although Cinderella didn't really have a lot of agency, you slowly up the ante. So every time they overcome an obstacle, it gets harder and harder and harder for them to achieve their goal because the obstacles get harder and harder and harder.
So overall, I found this chapter to be full of like a bunch of small things. It was what I would expect out of a workshop lecture by someone that wanted to go over what they saw as important to plot, but didn't necessarily want to take you through the steps to do your own.
Yeah.
But there was something kind of special in this chapter that I was not expecting. The problem you run into when you're writing these things is that you either choose an actual novel or an actual story to pull apart and show how the author did it, or you have to write your own example of what you might do. I think the former is a much better approach because you have a story that was actually written and published, as opposed to something you're just thinking up off the top of your head, which honestly, if I were writing an advice book and had a really good idea for a story, I wouldn't use it as an example because I'd want to go write it myself.
Right. Yeah. He does talk about one story that's been published, but all the other ones he just kind of made up supposedly on the spot. He wrote 3 novels before this point. He could have outlined his own novel.
So for his particular examples, he wants to show how you'd plot a novel based on a climax. So one of them is a story where the climactic scene is a semi-driver hits a vendor's pickup. It feels like something very amateur and something that a beginner writer would come up with and a teacher would say, that's very good for exercise. No, don't write a real novel.
I agree.
He basically chooses some fairly weak setups for this. He started with a climactic scene of a woman who runs over a traffic flagman. And I think that in this case, we can just read some of the stuff he came up with because it really is delightful. It starts with, you need to pick your central character. It's a woman. So Gardner says the choices are a harried, unhappy housewife, a tough female executive, or a stripper. Can you guess which one Gardner picks?
Oh, he picks the stripper. That's the choices: housewife, tough executive, or stripper. Man.
So let me read to you the paragraph in which he develops this character.
Man, who wants to read it? Do you want to read it?
I want to read it. Let us say that our stripper, Fanny, is 36.
Go on, do it again. Start over. Fanny.
Let us say that our stripper, Fanny, is 36, well-preserved, even beautiful, but hard put to compete with younger strippers of the new breed. She's an old style stripper, the kind who teases and scorns her male audience as if taunting them, asking to be tamed. A classic act. She's been the star for years. But her act, like her body, is slipping. Her act is of the highly polished kind. She unclothes slowly, tormentingly, with artistic style. She has, let us say, trained white doves who fly away with each article of clothing she takes off.
Lord.
Younger strippers who are beginning to challenge her top billing are new style strippers. Nakedness means nothing to them. They take off their clothes as indifferently as trees drop leaves. And their acts, because of their easy and uninhibited sexuality, have no need of high artifice or polish. Whereas Fanny grew up in Texan, of stern Southern Baptist stock, and fled to burlesque in troubled defiance, guiltily but brazenly, the new breed grew up in cities like San Francisco and feels no such inner conflict.
Texas versus San Francisco. Those harlots in San Francisco. Like, really? It's so bizarre. That was I was taken aback. I was reading this like stripper. Are you serious? Stripper? And then it just got worse and worse and worse. You know, he adds in, okay, this is a plot, but where's the theme? How would the theme be applied to this and affect the writer's choices of this story? The theme of our story about Fanny the stripper might be, of course, male chauvinism. No.
Maybe.
No, really? Or it might be art versus life, or nature, or nakedness in all its forms. The writer's choice of theme, partly Fanny's choice, will dictate his selection and organization of details, his style, and so forth. For instance, if the theme the writer chooses is nakedness, he will choose other details to brood on and develop. The chipping paint on the dressing room walls, for instance, the psychological nakedness of some character, the manager's unwillingness to disguise or cover over his lack of interest in Fanny's well-being, or if it comes to that, his hatred of all she represents.
Some of the lines are just so beautiful. Like, while he writes into the process of repeated revisions, what is it that he really thinks? How naked should we be, or can we be? Is openness and vulnerability a virtue or a defect? To what extent? With what important qualifications? He finds himself bringing in black strippers, perhaps an Indian stripper, supported by imagery that recalls primitive nakedness.
Oh, man, he really went there.
You know, he did not have to put this section in. There were a number of people that could have told him this does not belong here.
My theory, I'd mentioned to somebody, we have a Patreon member who's been commenting. We've been having conversations with them, which you can read on Patreon if you'd like. I had this idea like, well, you know, it could be that because this was published posthumously, that they couldn't edit it. They had this manuscript and they're going to publish it because, you know, I guess he has had a few novels out and he is kind of a name. And they're like, oh, crap, look at all this stuff in there. It's extremely racist and sexist. But he's dead. We can't ask him to change it. So maybe they felt, maybe no one will read this anyway. Oh, but why would they publish it if no one would read it? I don't know.
Or it could be that his estate was his ex-wife and she said, yeah, just leave it all in there.
One for his ex-wife.
Is it just that nobody gets to this stage of the book? Up at this point, it was a bit, but I could see someone skimming over. Like, it was only when we actually counted the number of females mentioned that you realize how imbalanced it is. It's only when you get that comment that he says that the majority of really good writers he knows is female that you realize something is up. But those are all very subtle things that you can miss. There's no way you can miss Fanny the stripper.
There is no way you can miss Fanny the stripper.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I just think people forgave this stuff. And some people probably laughed and going, ha, 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 ha. And maybe a lot of women just shrug their shoulders because, you know, they're used to going to the office and getting spanked on their ass. I think we've forgiven a lot of people for a long time. And there is now a reckoning. This book has not aged well. I think there's this pushback in department and stuff to include race and gender studies and all this. And I think he's just pushing back.
Specifically being a provocateur here.
Yeah.
He's trolling us.
Yeah. He's trolling the department. He's trolling schools and just being a total douchebag.
The issue you run into is because he decided to do these over-the-top examples of what a plot is, it's not an advantage for a young writer reading it because it's like throw a whole bunch of crazy shit together and call it a story and have it end in a car crash. It makes sense for someone writing a book to either use plots that they've actually successfully published or other people have published as examples because it shows what people actually get published. I don't think any of these stories described here just doesn't feel like any of them are really publishable without some major changes or some brilliant writing. And I definitely don't think Fanny the Stripper is publishable.
No, I wouldn't read it.
It's not even that original or funny. I mean, at least, the Mongolians riding through San Francisco is kind of out there. But this one here is just standard generic plot.
Yeah. The title of his book, The Art of Fiction, Notes on the Craft for Young Writers. He really lets down the young writer. He doesn't really give us a good analysis of a real plot, a real successful novel.
So, exercise time. I will say that one thing I am actually impressed with is his exercise in this book. I think the exercises are very interesting. I've learned a lot.
Yeah, the plot activity. So, listener, if this is the first episode you're listening to, go to the second episode and we really break down plot. And I learned so much from that. Kim set me straight. Like I went wild. And then she broke down to how to do it or what was wrong with it and what choices I could have made. And it's like the light went on in my head. I was like, oh, and man, it was really helpful. So if you have an issue with plot, episode 2 is pretty good. And yeah, all of these activities, I gotta say, not bad. I mean, I've learned a lot. Also, we've learned a lot because we have each other.
Mm-hmm.
What is the next one you'd like to do? We've already done the plot exercise.
For the exercise this week, we are going to do number 2 on page 202. Take a simple event. A man gets off a bus, trips, looks around in embarrassment, and sees a woman smiling. So we describe this event using the same characters and elements of setting in 5 completely different ways. Change of style, tone, sentence structure, voice, psychic distance, etc. And make sure the styles are radically different. Otherwise, the exercise is wasted. And our time is wasted.
Waste our time. Like he wasted ours.
We might take the man gets off the bus setup, or we might come up with an individual one that's completely different. But again, a very simple, straightforward, simple set of events. And the other thing is that while we will do all 5 versions, we will not read all 5 versions on this podcast. However, we will make them available to our Patreon subscribers. So we're going to go do our writing and we'll be back in a moment with what we came up with.
All right. So this activity was really interesting. I really enjoyed it.
Why did you enjoy it?
I could tell that this was something I really had to think about. It actually pointed out some skills I need to hone a little bit more.
Excellent. Let's have you read your examples.
Okay, so here's the first one. Last step, and he ate concrete. Full-on faceplant by the front bus wheel. Everyone in the queue all had that collective, damn that hurt, glad it's not me sympathy smeared all over their faces. No one moved to help, or maybe he didn't give them a chance. While the old lady stared with her rolly cart full of wrapped Christmas presents and the bus driver still sucking on his Marlboro, dude just placed his palms on the oily concrete and hoisted himself with his military issue rucksack like it was nothing. He even cracked a little grin to go with his red face. But there was this one chick, all smiles like a Cheshire cat, super creepy and toothy and cartoony. Odd thing, we both saw it too. And then here's my second one. Josh remembered the day he met her. He had arrived in Albuquerque on a Sunday. The door clunked open and the August heat mingled with exhaust and dust and man sweat swept into the bus. He looked up from the steps and adjusted his sack between his shoulder blades, just as Carol, her black curls expertly coiled atop her head, sauntered like a model on a runway toward him, her arms crossed over her sundress, which billowed slightly in the exhaust of an oncoming greyhound. Josh commanded her gaze, or perhaps she commandeered his, just as his foot left the last step, but never found the ground. He fell onto hands and knees, and his eyebrow kissed the concrete, blood and sweat dripping over his left eye. When he righted himself, he looked up and saw Carol smiling. It was a fun activity, but it really made me think. I actually had done this activity twice, and I did the activity wrong, which seems to be a theme for me. I don't seem to be able to follow the prompt very well, which is funny because I have a whole lecture on this for my students on following the prompt.
What mistake did you make?
I changed the setting. I told a different plot with the same elements, like a man falls out of a bus, gets up and sees a woman smiling. I changed the psychic distance. I changed the tone. I changed the style in each and every one. But what I changed also was the setting.
And you changed the characters too.
And I changed the characters. There was always a man, there was always a woman, there was always a smiling, and there was always a trip. But I changed everything up. So I redid it. I tried to make it so that the plot was always the same, but I only focused on my first person or third person omniscient or third person limited, or, change the point of view, change the tone, change the style, things like that.
So what would you say the changes between the two pieces you read were?
So the first one, I tried to get into the head of somebody who is watching this. This person is not involved in the drama. They're just a passerby, a spectator. This spectator was just some dude. They can maybe early 20s, kind of maybe either hip or just some random dude, and he's got some street smarts. The voice just kind of came to me and I just jumped on it. Comes out a little gritty and slangy, mannered, I guess, Gardner would say.
What I really loved was the rhythm and the flow. It just had a nice stream of consciousness, but also just the beats and the pattern of the words. It's similar to some of the stuff you do for your memoir, your writing style. Just a bit more raw, a little bit more snarky, a little more judgy.
Yeah, it's closer to the style that I already write in. Mm-hmm. It was the easiest one to write.
And then for the next one, what did you change?
I went through the list, change of style, of tone, sudden structure of voice, psychic distance. Like, what am I going to do? And I decided, okay, I will change the tone and I will change the point of view. So I made sure it wasn't a spectator. I made it the guy who was falling. Mm-hmm. But I also had to make sure it was the same guy that the spectator saw. And I didn't want him to be like that other guy. I feel like this is a private eye getting off a bus and meeting this woman who maybe wrote him a letter. In fact, I kept thinking it's like the 50s, but it couldn't be because the slang in the previous one wouldn't match that. It's more contemporary.
It has a noir feel to it. It has a dame. It has a schlub of a guy. It has all that awkward gender dynamics. And I don't think that's an accident. I think that Gardner set this thing up to be that kind of gender dynamics.
Oh.
When we get to my piece, I chose not to use his setting at all because I could just feel Gardner's editorial commentary. You got this guy that has an accident and a woman is smiling at him, and there is just that edge to it. You know that she's trouble and he's going to be a fool. You did it in a way that didn't feel nearly as demeaning as what was going on in my head when I was trying to come up with ideas for this scene.
There is a power dynamic using the words commanded and commandeered, but I tried to keep them equal as possible. Like, who has the power here?
It didn't feel like it demeaned either of them. It felt less like a kind of schlocky 1950s pulpy detective and more like, an opening to a Netflix where she's going to be kind of cool and he's going to be kind of cool and you're going to have some cool stuff happening.
Yeah.
So you changed the point of view and you changed the tone for that one. Was there anything else you were thinking about when you were writing that second version?
I guess style too. These would be two different books. That's what I was thinking. If it was in one book from this point of view, it would be written like that. And if it was another book like a noir, then it would be the other way.
Thing I noticed in the second one is it starts with Josh remembered the day he met her. And that just has the setup for this is going to be a story between these two people. Whereas the other one, because it's an outside observer, we don't know what the twist is going to be. It's really focused on the guy falling. And then you bring in this woman at the very end. The dynamics of it feel differently too. One of them is like, okay, I'm going to read this to look at this guy and this woman and what it is about this woman. And the other one is all about, well, what happens to this guy when he falls?
Yeah. I will say that this was pointing out one of, it's, like I said, I called it a flaw, and maybe it is a flaw. It definitely tickles that edge of my writing ability right now. I need to work on movement, how to display movement in writing. like just a movement of somebody falling. How do I describe it so I don't over describe it, but I also don't confuse people? It felt very much like when I write directions in my handouts for my students. I'm very careful, like what language am I going to choose to get them to do what I want? And my brain immediately zeroed in on what exactly do I want in my reader's head? And it was hard. I'm like, do I talk about feet? Do I talk about the ground? When do I talk about the ground? I kept leaning towards more and more description to ensure that they saw it. And then I had to pull back going, they don't need the pressure of the foot and all that stuff. I mean, that could happen, but I didn't want to overdo that.
Well, the problem is the more detail you give it, the more it slows it down. So you lose the energy.
That's true.
It's a balance between making sure that the reader can see it, but also that they're actually still engaged in the scene and they don't turn on their analytical brain to say, okay, so his right hand is here and his left hand is here, even though you as a writer need to say, well, his right hand is here and his left hand is here. And often when I'm writing stuff, I actually sometimes have to stand up and say, okay, if I'm going to take this step here, if I'm going to do this thing with my arm or elbow, this is how it feels in my body.
Yeah, but then does the reader need to know that?
Well, the reader doesn't need to know that, but I need to know that.
Yeah, I can see that, because even though the reader doesn't see where the elbow is, maybe that comes in later anyway.
Well, you were saying there was a book, a fantasy book of the Game of Thrones, that he actually wrote out the scenes in such a way that when you watched the HBO version, every grunt, every swing, every block was there.
What was wonderful is it wasn't in painstaking detail. It was in precise detail. He just picked the perfect words and the perfect way of saying them so that you saw it, but you didn't read pages upon pages of description. He just like boiled his language down to the necessary. And it was like, yeah, the people who made the show, at least for the first season, the people who made the show didn't have to change much. It's like they already had all the stage directions they needed.
Mm-hmm. Really great job on this exercise, Renee. It turned out so well. I'm glad you got something out of it.
Thank you. Do you think Gardner would have liked what I did?
Oh, he would have loved it.
Really?
Oh, yeah. This is totally what he was looking for.
Wow, I feel good.
Although he totally would have slammed you for your first version.
Oh, because I didn't follow the prompt.
He would have called you out in front of the class and said nasty things about you.
Gardner's jerk. I would have left crying. No, I wouldn't have left crying. I would have just gotten really mean and angry and stewed and then rewritten it.
And then when he complimented you, you'd be ticked off too.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've finished the book now.
It's done.
At this point, we have gone through the entire Gardner book. And so next time, we are going to do an overview of what we think of the book. That'll be our next podcast.
It'll be like a summary / review, kind of recap a lot of stuff.
I think having spent this much time looking at all the chapters, we can give a really good evaluation and a good review about what's good in this book and what isn't good in this book.
And then you can decide for yourself, dear listener, whether or not you should read it or buy it.
Or if you want to recommend a podcast or someone who's interested to read the book, they can just do that podcast. So we're talking smaller and smaller chunks. So you can either listen to the previous whole season of this, or you can just do the final version.
Totally. And if you would like to read some examples or check it out for yourself without actually having to read the book, go ahead and check out those show notes on our website.
And our bonus podcast for our Patreon viewers is going to be going through my version of this exercise, and I have a slightly different scene, so you won't be hearing about a man and a woman smiling in a bus. It's a little bit different.
It's, I think, more fun. But if you want to hear it, you have to join Patreon. You know, it's only $2 a month for the Abby tier. Abby the Fabulous, I believe, which is my cat. But if you go for the Pinto tier, Pinto the Ambitious,
we'll come up with a couple other of these sort of framework scenes, and you can try your own hand at it. Maybe you might even get to 5 versions of it. That'd be great. We would be very impressed. I think it's a really great exercise. And the more versions you do, the deeper you get into what makes up the scene and what you can play around with and how you can use these different elements of style, tone, sentence structure, voice, psychic distance in different ways in your writing.
This one in particular feels like a workout. Like you really have a workout here going, oh my God, I have to use what I know about creative writing and scene in detail. Like it really comes together. Honestly, this is a good activity that we're going to post for you to do on Patreon. And if you want to try your hand at it, we'll give you feedback.
And if you're not interested in Patreon, no big deal. But what you could do to really help us out is to go to the service you're subscribing to and rate us and subscribe to the podcast. And if it's got a spot for review, and you can use whatever style of writing you want to compliment or to review our site. You can use different psychic distance, different tone, all that stuff. That's fine.
Yeah, our own activity. And if you know anybody that is a writer and they're writing a book and you think this would be helpful for them, share our podcast. Say, hey, I found this, thought you might like it. That would be really helpful for us.
Okay. Thank you guys so much for listening. And we will see you in 2 weeks or maybe a little more. We'll see how that goes.
See you soon.
Words to Write By is produced by Renee Nelson and Kim Smiga-Allen. Our theme music is Roll Back the Carpet by Cool Cat Music. Have a great day.
I just put my eggs in the poetry basket.